James Aldridge, Duke of Whitmore, had requested, through the careful and entirely transactional channels by which such things were arranged, a wife possessed of the following qualities: composure, discretion, an appreciation for the responsibilities her position would require, and a temperament suited to the management of a household and an estate that did not, under any circumstances, generate additional complications in a life that already contained more than sufficient complication. He had not requested unruly hair. He noticed the hair before he noticed anything else about her, standing in the receiving hall of Whitmore House on the appointed morning, watching the carriage that had been arranged to deliver his future wife roll to a stop in the courtyard below, and watching as the carriage door opened, a young woman descended with dark curls that had clearly abandoned at some point during the journey whatever careful arrangement her maid had constructed that morning, and that now framed her face with the specific chaotic energy of hair that had decided it answered to no one's expectations, including its own owners. She looked up at the house. He watched her take in its considerable grandeur, the columned facade, the carefully maintained grounds, the specific architecture of wealth that had been accumulating in his family for 6 generations, and watched her expression settle into something that was not quite awe and was not quite intimidation, but a particular assessing steadiness that he found, against his own expectations for how this morning was supposed to proceed, mildly unsettling. She did not look like a woman who had been selected through careful negotiation between her family and his solicitors, specifically for her composure. He went down to meet her with the specific reluctant formality of a man discharging an obligation he had constructed himself several months prior, with what he had believed at the time was considerable wisdom. "Miss Whitfield," he said when he reached the courtyard, with a bow precisely calibrated to the correct degree of formal courtesy. "I am Whitmore." "I assumed as much," Esther Whitfield said, "given that this is your house and you are wearing the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed this greeting and is now discovering that the rehearsal did not adequately prepare him for the actual encounter." James looked at her for a long moment. This was not, he understood immediately, going to proceed the way he had imagined. "I am uncertain," he said carefully, "how to respond to that observation." "You do not need to respond to it," Esther said. "I find observations are frequently more useful left simply stated than responded to. It saves considerable time that might otherwise be spent on diplomatic deflection." She looked past him at the house, with the same assessing steadiness she had directed at it from the carriage. "This is considerably larger than I expected." "It is the family seat," James said. "It has been for 6 generations." "That explains the size," Esther said. "It does not explain why you require a wife selected through legal negotiation rather than the conventional method of courtship most people of your position apparently prefer." James felt the specific discomfort of a man whose carefully constructed arrangement was being examined with more directness than he had anticipated needing to manage on the very first morning. "I find conventional courtship," he said, "to be an inefficient process built largely on performance and calculation disguised as romantic feeling. I preferred a more direct approach to securing a suitable match." "And you believe," Esther said, "that what you have secured through this direct approach is suitable?" James looked at her, at the unruly hair and the direct, unflinching gaze and the particular quality of challenge in her voice that suggested she had decided, within minutes of arrival, that suitability was very much an open question rather than a settled fact, and felt, for the first time in considerable years, genuinely uncertain how to proceed. "I do not yet know," he said honestly, which surprised him more than it apparently surprised her. "Neither do I," Esther said. "I find that an honest answer, at least, which I appreciate considerably more than I expected to appreciate anything about this morning." James Aldridge had constructed the specific, deliberate arrangement that brought Esther Whitfield to his courtyard for reasons he considered at the time entirely rational, and that he had not previously felt any particular need to examine beyond their surface logic. He was 34 years old, the Duke of Whitmore for 11 of those years, having inherited the title and its considerable accompanying responsibilities at 23, far earlier than he had anticipated needing to assume them, following his father's sudden death from a heart that had apparently been failing for some time without anyone, including his father, having noticed the warning signs in time to address them. He had spent the 11 years since building Whitmore into something his father's careless management had nearly destroyed. Debts his father had accumulated through a combination of poor investment and worse judgment, tenant farms that had been neglected for years, a household staff that had not been paid reliably in the final years of his father's life. James had rebuilt all of it through a combination of careful management, considerable personal sacrifice, and a deliberate suppression of nearly every impulse that did not directly serve the estate's recovery. He had not, in those 11 years, permitted himself much in the way of personal life. He had watched his peers marry for love, or for advantageous connection, or for whatever combination of both their particular circumstances permitted, and he had observed, with what he considered clear-eyed honesty, that emotional investment in a marriage tended to produce considerable vulnerability he could not currently afford, given everything Whitmore still required of him, given the specific exhaustion of having spent his entire adult life managing a crisis his father had created and never adequately acknowledged. He had decided, with what he believed was considerable practical wisdom, that a contractual marriage, arranged through proper legal channels, with clearly defined expectations on both sides, free of the messy emotional complications that romantic courtship typically generated, represented the most sensible path toward the heir Whitmore required and the stable household his position demanded. He had specified to the solicitor who managed the arrangement exactly the qualities he believed such a wife should possess: composure, discretion, an appreciation for duty, a temperament that would not generate additional complications in an already complicated life. He had not anticipated that the young woman selected through this careful process would arrive with hair that refused arrangement, and an expression that suggested she had already formed several pointed opinions about him before they had exchanged a single word. He found, standing in his own courtyard within minutes of her arrival, that his careful arrangement had already begun proceeding considerably differently than he had planned. Esther Whitfield had agreed to this arrangement for reasons that had very little to do with romantic possibility and considerably more to do with practical necessity, though she had not yet explained these reasons to the Duke standing before her with his carefully calibrated bow and his evident discomfort at being questioned so directly. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a country gentleman whose modest estate had been for the past 3 years in a state of slow and increasingly desperate financial decline, not through any particular fault of her father's, who had managed his limited resources with reasonable competence, but through a combination of poor harvests, an inherited debt from his own father that had never been fully resolved, and the simple mathematics of maintaining a household and 3 unmarried daughters on income that had not kept pace with the family's accumulated obligations. Esther was the eldest of the 3 daughters, and she had watched, over the preceding 3 years, her father's mounting anxiety about their family's future with a clarity that had convinced her, well before any specific proposal arrived, that she would need to marry strategically rather than romantically if her family was to survive its current difficulties intact. She had also survived 4 years prior an engagement to a man named Henry Ashford that had taught her considerably more about the dangers of emotional investment than any romantic novel's cautionary warnings ever could have managed. Henry had courted her with genuine apparent affection for nearly a year, had proposed with what seemed at the time like sincere devotion, and had then, within months of their engagement, revealed himself to be considerably more interested in her family's modest but stable property than in Esther herself. A revelation that arrived through the specific humiliation of discovering, via a mutual acquaintance's careless comment, that Henry had been simultaneously courting another young woman with a considerably larger fortune, and had simply been keeping Esther as a secured option in case the wealthier prospect did not materialize. The engagement had ended, predictably and painfully, when the wealthier prospect did materialize, and Henry abandoned Esther with barely adequate explanation, leaving her to manage the public humiliation of a broken engagement in a society that generally assumed such breaks reflected some deficiency in the abandoned party, rather than the abandoning one. She had decided, in the aftermath of that experience, that she would never again permit herself the specific vulnerability of genuine emotional investment in a romantic prospect. She had decided that practical contractual arrangements, clearly defined, free of false promises about devotion that might or might not prove genuine, represented a considerably safer approach to marriage than the alternative she had already tried and watched fail catastrophically. When the Duke of Whitmore's proposal arrived, through the same careful legal channels James had specified, Esther had recognized in its very coldness a strange kind of safety. A man who wanted nothing more than composure and discretion was a man who was not asking her to risk her heart again. And after Henry, she had decided she preferred a marriage that demanded nothing emotional over one that might demand everything and deliver in return nothing but eventual betrayal. She had not anticipated that she would arrive at Whitmore House and immediately find herself irritated by the specific quality of the Duke's careful, formal coldness. Not because she wanted warmth from him, she told herself firmly, but because something about his rehearsed composure struck her as a performance she had no patience for, having spent the past 4 years building her own considerably more genuine armor against exactly this kind of careful social pretense. They were married within a fortnight, in a ceremony that proceeded with the specific, efficient correctness that James had specified to every party involved in its planning. No excess, no sentiment, simply the formal acknowledgement of a contractual arrangement now made legally binding. Esther wore a gown of pale blue that her mother had selected, since Esther herself had declined to express any particular preference, considering the entire occasion, in her own private assessment, considerably more administrative than romantic. James wore the formal attire his position required, and stood at the altar with the same careful composure he had displayed in the courtyard, watching his future wife approach with an expression that revealed, to anyone observing closely enough, considerably more uncertainty than his rehearsed stillness typically permitted. The ceremony concluded. The legal documents were signed. James Aldridge and Esther Whitfield were, by every formal measure society recognized, husband and wife. They were also, within the first week of actually living under the same roof, in a state of barely contained conflict that surprised both of them with its intensity, given how carefully each had constructed their expectations toward emotional distance rather than engagement. The first significant disagreement occurred over breakfast, 4 days into the marriage, when James observed, with what he believed was reasonable concern, that Esther had not yet engaged with Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, regarding the household's management. "I had assumed," he said, "that you would wish to establish your own arrangements with the staff promptly, given that household management falls within your purview as Duchess." "I have spoken with Mrs. Hawthorne," Esther said. "Extensively, in fact, on my second day here. I have concluded that her existing systems are perfectly competent and require no immediate adjustment from me." "I was not aware of this conversation," James said. "I was not aware I required your awareness of every conversation I conduct with my own household staff," Esther said, with a directness that caught him somewhat off guard. "I did not suggest you required my awareness," James said, with the particular careful precision he deployed when feeling that a conversation was proceeding less smoothly than he had anticipated. "I merely observed that I had not been informed." "Then I am informing you now," Esther said, retroactively. "I trust this satisfies whatever concern prompted the original observation." James looked at her across the breakfast table, at the same unruly hair, now arranged with somewhat more success than her arrival day had managed, but still carrying a particular rebellious quality at the edges, and at the directness in her gaze that he was beginning to understand was not a temporary adjustment to unfamiliar circumstances, but simply, fundamentally, who she was, and found himself uncertain whether the appropriate response was frustration or something considerably more complicated that he did not currently have adequate vocabulary to identify. "I had requested," he said with careful deliberation, "a wife of considerable composure and discretion." "I have considerable composure," Esther said. "I am being entirely composed right now, despite finding this conversation somewhat tedious. I am also discreet, in the sense that I have not discussed our domestic disagreements with anyone beyond this breakfast table." "I believe you may be conflating composure and discretion with compliance, Your Grace, which were not, as I recall the contract's specific language, among the qualities you formally requested." James was quiet for a long moment, recognizing with some discomfort that she was not entirely incorrect about the distinction. "You enjoy correcting my assumptions," he observed. "I enjoy accuracy," Esther said. "If your assumptions happen to require correction in order to achieve it, I do not consider that my failing." The pattern that established itself over the following weeks proved considerably more contentious than either of them had anticipated when each had separately concluded that emotional distance represented the safest possible foundation for a marriage neither had entered with romantic expectation. James found himself increasingly frustrated by Esther's consistent refusal to simply accommodate the specific behavioral expectations his position required. Her tendency to speak directly in social settings where careful diplomatic vagueness was the conventional approach, her evident disinterest in modifying her appearance to match society's preferred presentation of a duchess, her general unwillingness to treat his title with the deference he had, without fully examining the assumption, expected it would naturally generate. Esther found herself increasingly frustrated by James's careful, controlled distance, not because she wanted warmth, she told herself with diminishing conviction as the weeks progressed, but because something about his rigid self-management struck her as a man actively working to avoid being known, and she had begun to find this avoidance considerably more irritating than she had expected a contractual husband's emotional distance to be. The specific argument that crystallized their accumulated tension occurred 6 weeks into the marriage at a dinner party hosted by Lord and Lady Pemberton, where Esther's directness collided, in front of 30 assembled guests, with exactly the kind of social performance James had spent his entire adult life carefully maintaining. Lady Pemberton had asked Esther, with the particular pointed delicacy London's elite employed when probing for scandal they wished to appear above probing for, whether she found the considerable adjustment to ducal life difficult to manage. "I find," Esther said, with a directness that James felt land across the table like a small, precise explosion, that the adjustment to ducal life is considerably less difficult than the adjustment to a husband who appears to believe that marriage requires no genuine engagement beyond the production of an heir and the maintenance of appropriate appearances. I am managing the title perfectly well. I am still determining how to manage the husband." The table went very quiet. James felt his careful composure, maintained across 11 years of practiced self-control, threatened to crack entirely in front of an audience he had spent considerable effort cultivating as allies, rather than witnesses to his own private failures. "My wife," he said, with the careful diplomatic recovery he had perfected across years of managing difficult social situations, possesses a refreshing directness that I find considerably preferable to the careful artifice most social occasions typically require. "Your wife," Esther said, "possesses a directness that her husband apparently finds considerably less preferable in private than he is currently claiming in public, given the specific quality of his expression at this exact moment." The dinner concluded with considerably more tension than Lord and Lady Pemberton's table typically generated, and the carriage ride home proceeded in a silence that contained more genuine conflict than either of them had yet permitted themselves to voice directly. "You embarrassed me," James said finally, once they were alone in the privacy of the carriage. "I told the truth," Esther said. "If the truth embarrassed you, I would suggest the embarrassment originates in the truth's content, rather than in my decision to state it." "There is a considerable difference," James said, "between honesty and deliberate provocation." "I was not being deliberately provocative," Esther said. "I was being accurately descriptive of a marriage that has, for 6 weeks now, consisted primarily of careful distance and occasional disagreement about household management. If you find that description embarrassing, I would suggest examining what we have actually built together, rather than examining my willingness to describe it honestly." James looked at her in the carriage's dim interior, frustration and something considerably more complicated warring in his expression. "I do not know what you want from me," he said with a rawness that surprised them both. "I do not know either," Esther said, and for the first time since her arrival, her own careful composure showed the particular strain of someone admitting genuine uncertainty rather than deploying a calculated observation. "I did not enter this marriage expecting to want anything beyond practical security. I find, somewhat to my own frustration, that the wanting has become considerably more complicated than I originally anticipated." The first genuine crack in James's careful composure appeared not through any deliberate decision, but through simple accumulated exhaustion on an evening 2 months into their marriage, when Esther found him in his study considerably later than his usual hour, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, with an expression of strain she had not previously witnessed on his typically guarded face. "You are still working," she observed from the doorway, with less of her usual challenge and more of a genuine, careful curiosity. "The northern tenant farms require attention," James said, without looking up. "My father's mismanagement created problems that have taken 11 years to fully address, and I find new complications still emerging with a regularity that I had hoped, by this point, would have diminished considerably." "Your father," Esther said. She had heard in the careful way information traveled through household staff and distant family connections, fragments about the old Duke's difficulties, but James had never directly discussed them. James set down his pen and looked at her for a long moment, as though deciding whether the exhaustion of the evening had stripped away enough of his usual careful management to permit an honest answer. "My father," he said, "was a man who believed that being a duke meant simply enjoying the privileges of the position without genuinely managing its responsibilities. He spent considerable resources on personal indulgence and considerably less attention on the estate that generated those resources, and by the time he died, suddenly at 51, of a heart that had apparently been failing for years without his bothering to address it, Whitmore was in a state of genuine crisis. Debts I did not learn the full extent of until months after his funeral. Tenant farms neglected to the point of near collapse, staff who had not been paid reliably in years and who stayed regardless, out of loyalty to a house rather than to the man currently failing it." Esther came further into the study, drawn by a quality of genuine vulnerability in his voice that she had not previously heard from him. "I was 23, James continued. "I inherited not merely a title but an active crisis, and I had no preparation for managing it beyond whatever I could learn rapidly enough to prevent total collapse. I spent the following years rebuilding everything my father had nearly destroyed, and I did so largely alone because admitting the full extent of the difficulty to anyone beyond my solicitors felt at the time like admitting a vulnerability I could not afford society to perceive. That is," Esther said quietly, "a considerable weight to carry alone." "I am accustomed to carrying weight alone," James said. "I have been doing it for 11 years. I find I do not entirely know how to do anything else, even now, when the immediate crisis has been resolved, and Whitmore is, by any reasonable measure, genuinely stable again." "Is that why you arranged this marriage the way you did?" Esther asked. "Not out of coldness, but because genuine partnership required a vulnerability you had trained yourself out of permitting." James was quiet for a long moment, the question landing with more precision than he had expected from someone he had, until recently, primarily experienced as a source of social friction rather than genuine insight. "Yes," he said finally, "I believe that is exactly why. I told myself I wanted composure and discretion because those qualities felt safe, manageable, predictable, free of the considerable risk that comes with actually being known by another person. I did not anticipate that the woman selected for those specific qualities would arrive determined to be known regardless of what I had requested. I did not arrive determined to know you specifically," Esther said, with a directness that had by this point become considerably less abrasive and considerably more genuinely curious. "I arrived determined not to be erased into compliance, having learned through previous painful experience exactly how dangerous it is to disappear into what someone else wants you to be." "Previous experience," James said, recognizing in her careful phrasing the shape of something she had not yet directly shared with him. Esther was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to offer. "I was engaged once," she said, 4 years ago. A man named Henry Ashford, who courted me with what seemed at the time like genuine affection, and who revealed eventually that he had been simultaneously courting another woman with a considerably larger fortune, and had simply been keeping me as a secured option in case the wealthier prospect failed to materialize. Her voice remained steady, though James could hear beneath the steadiness the specific careful control of someone managing old pain rather than someone fully unaffected by it. "I decided, after Henry, that I would never again permit myself the vulnerability of genuine emotional investment in a romantic prospect. When your proposal arrived, through such careful legal channels, free of any pretense of devotion, I recognized in its coldness a strange kind of safety. A man who wanted nothing more than composure was a man who was not asking me to risk my heart again. James absorbed this with genuine, undisguised attention. "I am sorry," he said, genuinely, "that Henry treated you so carelessly and that you have spent 4 years protecting yourself against a repetition of that carelessness." "Thank you," Esther said. "I do not require sympathy particularly, though I appreciate the sentiment." She looked at him with an expression considerably softer than her usual challenge. "I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I have spent the past 2 months arguing with you about household management and social performance, when perhaps the actual disagreement was always about something considerably more fundamental, both of us protecting ourselves against vulnerabilities the other could not initially see." "I find," James said, "that I would like to see them now, if you are willing to show me." The genuine crisis of their developing marriage arrived 3 months into it, in the specific form of Henry Ashford himself, who appeared at a London ball with the particular confident ease of a man who had not anticipated his past romantic failures catching up with him in the form of his former fiancée's new and considerably elevated social position. Esther saw him before he saw her, across Lady Cavendish's crowded ballroom, and felt the specific physical reaction of old trauma reasserting itself without her conscious permission, a tightness in her chest, a particular coldness in her hands, the accumulated weight of 4 years' careful self-protection suddenly tested by simple proximity to the man who had taught her why such protection was necessary. James noticed her reaction before she had fully composed herself to hide it. "What is it?" he said quietly, following her gaze across the room. "Henry Ashford," Esther said, with a steadiness that cost her considerable effort to maintain. James looked at the man in question, moderately handsome, comfortably dressed, currently engaged in animated conversation with a small group of acquaintances with the easy confidence of someone who had never genuinely faced consequences for his own poor conduct, and felt a protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. "Would you prefer to leave?" he asked. "I would prefer not to give him the satisfaction of believing his presence still has the power to alter my evening," Esther said. "But I confess I do not entirely trust my own composure if forced into direct conversation with him." "Then we will simply ensure that direct conversation does not occur," James said, with a decisive practicality that surprised her, "unless you specifically wish it to." He stayed close to her for the remainder of the evening, with a protective attentiveness that contained none of his usual careful distance, and when Henry did eventually approach, apparently unable to resist the social curiosity of confirming that his former fiancée had indeed married a duke, James intercepted the conversation with a directness that left no room for Henry's evident attempt at charming reconciliation. "Mr. Ashford," James said, before Henry had managed more than a few opening words directed at Esther. "I am told you are acquainted with my wife." "We were," Henry said, with a smile that James found immediately and thoroughly distasteful, "previously engaged some years ago. Circumstances did not permit the match to proceed, unfortunately, though I am delighted to see Esther has found such considerable happiness regardless." "The circumstances," James said, "were, I am given to understand, your own decision to pursue a wealthier prospect while maintaining my wife as a secured alternative. I find I have very little patience for discussing this history pleasantly, Mr. Ashford, and I would ask that you direct your future social attentions elsewhere." Henry's confident smile flickered, recalibrating rapidly in the face of a directness he had clearly not anticipated from a duke he had assumed would maintain polite social distance regardless of personal history. "Your Grace," he said, "I did not intend any offense." "You intended to cause considerable offense to my wife 4 years ago," James said. "I do not require you to repeat the performance in my presence." Henry withdrew with whatever remained of his composure, and James turned back to Esther with an expression that contained genuine concern beneath its protective firmness. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am," Esther said, and found, to her own surprise, that the statement was genuinely true, rather than merely composed performance. I find I am considerably more well than I expected to be, given the circumstances. Thank you for that. You do not need to thank me for defending you, James said. I find I wanted to do it considerably more than the situation strictly required, which suggests something about my own feelings that I am only now beginning to fully examine. The months that followed Henry's brief, unwelcome reappearance marked a genuine shift in the texture of James and Esther's marriage. Not a sudden transformation from conflict to harmony, which neither of their temperaments would have permitted even had circumstances suggested it, but a gradual accumulating warmth that developed alongside their continued directness rather than replacing it. James began seeking her opinion on estate matters he would previously have managed entirely alone, not out of obligation, but because he discovered, with some surprise, that her direct, unflinching assessment of problems frequently identified solutions his own more cautious approach had overlooked. "You think about the tenant situation the way you think about everything," he observed, on an afternoon she had spent reviewing his Northern Farms production records, with the same focused attention she brought to most things she found genuinely engaging. Directly, without the diplomatic softening that typically obscures the actual problem. I find diplomatic softening generally serves to protect the speaker's comfort rather than to genuinely address the listener's difficulty, Esther said. If your tenant farms require different management, telling you so plainly seems considerably more useful than constructing careful language that allows you to avoid hearing it clearly. I have come to appreciate that quality in you considerably more than I expected to, James said. I do not believe I have told you this directly, though I suspect you have noticed. I had noticed, Esther said, with the small smile that had developed over recent months into something genuinely warm rather than merely challenging. I find I have developed a similar appreciation for several of your own qualities, which I likewise had not anticipated. Which qualities specifically? James asked. Your genuine care for the people who depend on you, Esther said. I watched you discuss the northern tenants just now, and I recognized something I had not initially credited you with possessing. You do not manage Whitmore merely to preserve your own position. You manage it because you genuinely feel responsible for the people whose livelihoods depend on its success. That is considerably more admirable than the careful, performed competence I initially assumed was all you possessed. James looked at her with an expression that contained genuine warmth alongside something more complicated developing beneath it. I find, he said slowly, that what I feel for you has become considerably more than the practical arrangement I originally constructed. Esther was very still. I have noticed something similar developing in my own feelings, she said carefully, though I confess I have been managing the noticing with considerable wariness, given everything Henry taught me about the dangers of trusting such developments too readily. I am not Henry, James said. I know, Esther said. I have come to know that quite thoroughly over these recent months. I find the knowledge has not entirely resolved my wariness, though it has considerably diminished it. The genuine crisis of their developing marriage arrived not through any external threat, but through a discovery James made while finally, after months of his wife's gentle but persistent encouragement, sorting through his father's remaining private papers. Documents he had avoided examining in the 11 years since his father's death, partly from simple grief and partly from a reluctance to confront further evidence of his father's failures beyond what the financial crisis had already revealed. What he found was not further evidence of financial mismanagement, but something considerably more personally devastating. Correspondence revealing that his father had fathered a child outside his marriage, years before James's own birth. A half-sibling James had never known existed, born to a woman his father had apparently loved with a genuine devotion he had never extended to James's own mother, and who had been, by the correspondence's evidence, quietly provided for financially, while being entirely excluded from any acknowledgement or relationship with the family that might have, had circumstances been different, included her. James brought the discovery to Esther with an expression of genuine devastation that she had not previously witnessed on his typically composed features. I have a sister, he said, the words arriving with the particular flat shock of information too significant to process immediately. A half-sister. My father fathered a child with a woman named Margaret Hale years before he married my mother, and he provided for her financially throughout his life, while never once acknowledging her existence to anyone in his legitimate family. Esther took the correspondence from his hands and read through it carefully, recognizing immediately why the discovery had affected him so profoundly. "Do you know where she is now?" Esther asked. "This sister?" "The correspondence suggests she lives in Yorkshire," James said. "Margaret Hale died several years ago, according to the final letters, but her daughter, my sister, would be perhaps 30 now, living, as far as I can determine, in considerably reduced circumstances, given that my father's financial support apparently ceased entirely upon his own death, with no provision made for her continued welfare in his will." "James," Esther said, with a directness softened by genuine compassion, "you have a sister living in poverty, while you have spent 11 years rebuilding a fortune that, by any reasonable moral accounting, should have included provision for her as well." "I am aware," James said, the weight of this recognition visible in his entire posture. "I do not know how to process the fact that my father's failures extended considerably further than mere financial mismanagement. He abandoned an entire person, a child who deserved acknowledgement and support, in order to maintain the careful social fiction of a respectable family, unmarried by scandal." "What will you do?" Esther asked. James looked at his wife, at the woman who had arrived in his courtyard with unruly hair and an unwillingness to be anything other than exactly herself, who had spent the past several months teaching him, through her own consistent directness, that genuine integrity mattered considerably more than careful social performance, and found, in her steady, unflinching gaze, the specific courage he needed to make a decision he might otherwise have avoided out of fear for what acknowledging it publicly would cost his family's reputation. "I will find her," he said, "and I will acknowledge her properly, regardless of what scandal that acknowledgement generates. I have spent 11 years rebuilding Whitmore's finances while ignoring the deeper moral debt my father left behind. I do not intend to continue ignoring it simply because acknowledging it carries social risk." "I will help you find her," Esther said, "if you would like the assistance." "I would like that very much," James said. "I find I do not wish to face this particular reckoning alone, which is, I am beginning to understand, considerably different from how I have approached most difficulties in my adult life." They travelled to Yorkshire together within the fortnight, and found, after careful inquiry, a woman named Eleanor Hale, living in modest circumstances in a small cottage on the outskirts of a market town, working as a seamstress to support herself and the young daughter she was raising alone, her own husband having died 2 years prior of an illness that had left her with considerable debt and very little remaining security. Eleanor received them with understandable wariness, having no prior knowledge that her father's legitimate family even knew of her existence, let alone any expectation that the current Duke of Whitmore would appear at her door with his wife and an explanation of discovered correspondence. "I did not know my father had a title," Eleanor said, once James had explained, with careful and genuine humility, the circumstances that had brought them to her door. "My mother told me only that my father was a gentleman who could not acknowledge me publicly, due to circumstances she never fully explained. She died believing he had simply forgotten us once his financial support ceased without explanation." "He did not forget you," James said. "I have read his correspondence. He loved your mother, by every indication in his letters, with a depth he apparently never extended to my own mother, whom he married for considerably more practical reasons. I believe his failure to acknowledge you publicly was a failure of courage rather than a failure of feeling, though I recognize that distinction likely offers you very little genuine comfort given what the silence actually cost you." "It cost me considerably," Eleanor said, with a directness James recognized with some private wonder as remarkably similar to his own wife's. "I grew up without a father's acknowledgement, without his financial support once he died, without any of the advantages his legitimate children clearly received. I do not say this to generate guilt, Your Grace. I say it because you arrived asking for honesty, and I find honesty is the only currency I have ever genuinely possessed." "I would like to correct what I am able to correct," James said. "Not through guilt-driven charity, but through genuine acknowledgement of you as my sister, with whatever support and connection that acknowledgement should properly include. I cannot undo 11 years of silence. I can ensure the silence does not continue. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her own composure showing the particular strain of someone processing an unexpected reversal of fortune she had not permitted herself to hope for. I do not require charity, she said. I have managed considerable difficulty through my own resources and intend to continue doing so. I am not offering charity, James said. I am offering acknowledgement and whatever practical support a sibling relationship genuinely entails. You are entitled to a connection with this family that my father's cowardice denied you. I would like to provide what he should have provided, not as an obligation, but as genuine recognition of a family you should never have been excluded from. Esther, who had remained largely quiet during this exchange, watching the two siblings navigate their unexpected reunion, spoke for the first time. I understand, she said gently, exactly how difficult it is to trust an unexpected offer of genuine care after considerable experience with its absence. I do not ask you to trust us immediately. I ask only that you permit the possibility, over time, that this acknowledgement is genuine rather than performed. Eleanor looked between them, something in her careful composure beginning slowly to soften. I would like that, she said finally, cautiously, but genuinely. He proposed in the proper romantic sense rather than the contractual sense their marriage had originally proceeded from 6 months after their wedding, in the Whitmore garden, on an evening when the considerable weight of recent revelations, Eleanor's discovery, Henry's unwelcome reappearance, months of accumulated growth between two people who had each arrived expecting nothing beyond practical arrangement, had settled into something that felt, to both of them, considerably more significant than the contract that had originally bound them. I find, James said, that I have fallen in love with you, Esther. Genuinely, completely, in a way I did not believe myself capable of permitting after 11 years of careful self-protection, and considerably more thoroughly than I expected when I first specified, to my solicitor, the safe and uncomplicated qualities I believed I required in a wife. I received considerably more than safe and uncomplicated, Esther said, with the small smile that had become, over 6 months, one of his favorite things in existence. You did, James agreed. You arrived with hair that refused arrangement and a directness that initially terrified me, and you taught me across 6 months of consistent challenge and growing genuine affection that the vulnerability I spent 11 years avoiding was not actually the danger I had constructed it to be. It was simply the precondition for everything genuinely worth having. I did not arrive intending to teach you anything, Esther said. I arrived intending to protect myself from ever again risking the particular pain Henry taught me to fear. And now? James asked. And now, Esther said, I find I have fallen in love with you as well, James. Not despite my careful armor, but somehow through it. You did not ask me to remove the armor. You simply proved, consistently and genuinely, that armor was not required in your presence. And I find that proof has done what 4 years of my own determined self-protection never managed. It has made me willing to risk genuine vulnerability again. He reached for her, and she came to him, and in the garden where their entire marriage had genuinely begun to transform from contract into partnership, James Aldridge held the woman who had arrived, determined to be different from every wife society expected him to want, and understood that her difference was precisely what had taught him how to genuinely love rather than merely manage a marriage. The whispers that had followed Esther's directness since her arrival at Whitmore did not entirely cease. London's collective gossip rarely concluded simply because circumstances evolved, but they shifted gradually as society observed James and Esther together at increasing social occasions and witnessed something considerably more genuine than the careful contractual arrangement their marriage had originally been rumored to represent. Lady Pemberton, whose pointed question at that early dinner party had crystallized James and Esther's accumulated tension into public conflict, found herself, several months later, witnessing an entirely different dynamic between the Duke and Duchess of Whitmore, genuine warmth, easy conversation, the particular quality of partnership that no amount of careful performance could convincingly fabricate. I confess, she said to Esther at a subsequent gathering, I did not expect your marriage to develop quite this way, given its rather unconventional beginning. Neither did I, Esther said, with genuine honesty rather than defensive deflection. I arrived expecting a practical arrangement and very little else. I find I received considerably more than either James or I anticipated, though I confess the path toward that discovery proceeded with considerably more conflict than either of us initially expected to navigate. And the unruly hair? Lady Pemberton asked, with a small smile that suggested the question carried more genuine warmth than its surface phrasing implied. I recall considerable early commentary regarding your apparent disinterest in achieving the conventional presentation society typically expects of a duchess. I find, Esther said, that my hair has never required society's approval to be exactly what it is. I have come to believe the same is true of most genuine things. They do not improve through forced conformity to expectations that were never designed to accommodate them in the first place. The acknowledgement of Eleanor as James's half-sister generated predictably considerable initial scandal when it became publicly known. A duke acknowledging an illegitimate sibling was precisely the kind of social complication James's father had spent considerable effort avoiding throughout his own lifetime. But James managed the disclosure with a directness that mirrored his wife's own approach to difficult truths, presenting the situation not as scandal requiring careful management, but as simple moral correction of a previous generation's failure. My father made an error of courage rather than an error of love, James told the assembled gathering at the formal dinner where Eleanor was first publicly introduced as his sister. I do not intend to compound that error through continued silence simply because acknowledgement carries social risk. Eleanor is my sister. I am grateful, considerably more than I can adequately express, that circumstances have finally permitted this acknowledgement, regardless of how many years too late it arrives. The directness, considerably more than any careful diplomatic management could have achieved, settled the matter within London society more thoroughly than anyone had anticipated. A duke who addressed scandal directly, without apparent shame or evasion, proved considerably more difficult to gossip about productively than one who attempted careful concealment, and the story shifted within months from scandal to a kind of grudging admiration for the Whitmore family's willingness to correct old wrongs rather than perpetuate them. 5 years after a carriage had arrived in the Whitmore courtyard, carrying a young woman with hair that refused arrangement and a determination to be different from every wife society expected a duke to want, James and Esther Aldridge stood together in that same garden, watching their 2 children, 6-year-old Margaret, named for the grandmother whose unacknowledged love had eventually brought Eleanor into their family, and 4-year-old Thomas, who had inherited, somewhat to both his parents, private amusement, his mother's specific quality of unruly dark hair, playing together with the particular boundless energy of children secure in a household built on genuine partnership rather than careful performance. Eleanor visited regularly now, her own circumstances considerably improved through the genuine support James had insisted on providing, her relationship with her brother having developed, over 5 years, into something neither of them had initially dared hope for: real, comfortable family, built from acknowledgement rather than continued silence. You are thinking about the beginning, Esther said, watching her husband observe their children with the particular contemplative stillness she had learned over 5 years of marriage to recognize. I am thinking, James said, about how certain I was that I required composure and discretion above all else, and how completely wrong that certainty proved to be. I find I cannot adequately reconcile the man who specified those particular qualities to his solicitor with the man currently standing in this garden, grateful beyond measure for a wife who arrived determined to defy every expectation I had constructed. You did not actually want composure, Esther said. You wanted safety. I understand that now considerably better than I did when I first arrived, frustrated by what I assumed was simple coldness. And you did not actually want practical security alone, James said. You wanted, I believe, exactly what I wanted, though neither of us permitted ourselves to admit it directly. Genuine partnership, built on honesty rather than performance, with someone who would not abandon you the moment a more convenient option appeared. Henry taught me to fear that abandonment, Esther said. You taught me it was not inevitable. Your father's mismanagement taught you to fear vulnerability, James added of himself. You taught me that vulnerability, properly placed, was not actually the danger I had constructed it to be. Young Margaret, having successfully convinced her younger brother to participate in whatever elaborate game her 6-year-old imagination had constructed, called out to her parents with the specific delighted urgency of a child wanting her achievement witnessed. "Mama! Papa! Come see!" They went together to examine whatever remarkable thing their daughter had discovered or constructed, and Esther felt, as she frequently felt in moments exactly like this one, the particular gratitude of a woman who had arrived expecting nothing beyond practical arrangement and had received instead everything she had once believed too dangerous to permit herself to want. "Do you regret the unruly hair?" she asked James, with the small teasing smile that had become over 5 years one of his favorite things in the world. "I am told it generated considerable initial commentary regarding my suitability." "I have never," James said, "been more grateful for anything in my entire life than I am for hair that refused to be arranged into someone else's expectations. It was, I believe, the very first evidence I received that you would never simply become whatever I or society initially requested. And that refusal, more than any quality I originally specified to my solicitor, turned out to be exactly what I actually needed." He took her hand, and together they walked toward their children, in the garden where a contractual arrangement had slowly, genuinely, become a love story. Neither of them had believed themselves capable of permitting, built not on the careful composure James had once requested, but on the considerable courage it had taken both of them to allow themselves, eventually, to be fully known. He believed he wanted a wife who would simply comply with his careful expectations, asking nothing genuine in return. She believed she could never again risk the vulnerability that love requires, having already paid its price once before. And in a marriage that began as contract and obligation, 2 stubborn hearts discovered that the greatest courage was never changing who you are, but allowing someone, finally, to love you exactly as you are. Some hearts arrive expecting only safety. The bravest ones discover eventually that safety was never actually the point. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Tell us, have you ever discovered that the person you initially resisted was exactly who you needed? Subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and the quiet bravery of allowing yourself to be truly known.